Aspects of Scottish Church History. Lectures delivered on the Calvin Foundation in the Free University of Amsterdam, March 1927, by Donald Maclean, Doctor of Divinity, Professor of Church History, Free Church College, Edinburgh, author of The Law of the Lord's Day and the Celtic Church, etc. Lecture 2, The Crown in the Church, 17th Century. 1. The 17th century showed, over Western Europe, a marked change with reference to material and religious concerns. In England, secular interests became of greater moment than concern for the church and religion. Holland, where fierce and bloody wars of religion and persecution continued with little respite in the 16th century, became a prosperous nation of traders in the 17th century, and in France during the latter part of that century, Louis XIV made the church his cat's paw for personal aggrandizement, while in Germany the secularizing process that began about the middle of the century continued with increased momentum to the end of the century and beyond it. In Scotland alone there was heard with little cessation, during the 17th century, the reverberating sound of arms in a deadly struggle for the crown rights of the Redeemer. The British Revolution of 1689 was the inevitable culmination of the religious and civil aspirations of the Scottish reformers. The revolt of 1638-40 against Charles I and Laudian ecclesiasticism marked the beginning of the Stuart policy of repression of the Covenants and the religious and civil ideals they embodied by methods of such cruelty, evoking heroic resistance, as make the reigns of Charles II and James VII in particular, the most pitiful, the most revolting, and at the same time, the sublimest and most impressive period in Scottish history. It was a period of intolerance, but such intolerance was necessary for Scottish freedom, and whether this much-decried intolerance is examined in its origin or in its national and religious effects, no true Scottish patriot can deny its justification. The revolt began in Scotland, but it was England that completed it. But if the Stuarts were overthrown by English power, it was the Scots who taught them how to fight against regal despotism. Let us now briefly survey the salient features in the great national struggle that continued with little respite for 100 years. Two irreconcilable ideals were struggling for mastery. On the one hand, there was the fondly cherished belief on the part of the Stuart kings that the prince's will was the source of all law, or, in other words, that the sovereign had the inherent and divine right to dictate to his subjects the religious beliefs, the church polity, and civil government which they must accept. On the other hand, the vast bulk of the Scottish people had the unshakable conviction that the Bible alone was the source of all authority in the region of creeds and polity, and that it alone could dictate to their consciences with divine authority the imperative commands which they must obey, and that the king was ruler merely to give effect to these. The state, therefore, through king or parliament, had no right to control the church, but merely to coordinate the state's efforts with those of the church to bring in the kingdom of righteousness. This view was tersely put before King James in Falkland Palace by Andrew Melville, as he caught God's silly vassal by the sleeve, and said to him, "Sir, as divers times before I have told you, so now again I must tell you, there are 2 kings and 2 kingdoms in Scotland. There is King James, the head of this commonwealth, and there is Christ Jesus, the King of the Church, whose subject King James VI is, and of whose kingdom he is not a king, nor a lord, nor a head, but a member." This prerogative, gradually claimed by James VI of being the supreme governor of the kingdom over all persons and in all causes, was entirely alien to the traditions of the Scottish kingdom, and can be traceable, in part at least, to the evil influence of Esme Stuart, Lord of Aubigny, who instilled into his receptive mind views of kingly absolutism illustrated at the court of Henry III of France, and with them he sowed the seed of Scotland's future woes. 2. James VI himself was the comic offspring of the tragic union of Queen Mary with Darnley, and perhaps as a result of the Rizzio murder in his mother's presence when she was carrying him in her womb, he lacked moral and physical courage and was terrified of cold steel. He, however, had scholarly tastes, as a pupil of George Buchanan could not fail to have, but he was a pedant to the core, who was always as proud of unbuttoning his knowledge as he was of asserting his self-importance. But he knew Scotland, and although he claimed to rule his people by a clerk of the council, he tried to ameliorate their lot, and he advanced many national interests. He encouraged the translation of the authorized version of the Bible, and thereby, quite unconsciously, helped to create the weapon that finally shattered the Dagon of absolutism. The reading of the Bible and family prayers became a national custom among all classes. No literary movement in the annals of the Scottish race is at all comparable to the issuing of the authorized Bible in its effect on their character, imagination, and intelligence by creating the habit of reading and reflection in whole classes of the community. King James was Calvinist enough to send Calvinists to the Synod of Dort, 1618-19, but when Calvinism infringed on his divine right to rule as he liked and to live loosely as he pleased, his liking for it is best expressed by his own sparkling epigram that, quote, "As papistry is a disease on the mind, so is Puritanism on the brain," unquote. From his earliest days, James had one supreme ambition, and it was to be Queen Elizabeth's successor on the throne of England. So obsessed was he with this idea that a Jesuit writer of the time, with uncommon nearness to the truth, says he would take the crown from the hand of the devil himself. Alongside this ambition was a pet aversion, namely Presbyterianism. For according to himself, Presbytery, quote, "agreeth as well with a monarchy as God and the devil," unquote. In 1581, the Assembly at Glasgow, under the leadership of Andrew Melville, decided that presbytery and not episcopacy should be the polity of the national church. James, under pressure from his advisers, concurred. But once he reached the English throne and the object nearest his heart was to assimilate the Scottish Church to the model of the Church of England. In 1584, the Black Acts were passed by a subservient Parliament, and by these acts James became the absolute master of the bodies and souls of his subjects. By them the king was to be head of the church as well as the state, and no assemblies could be held without his sanction. Bishops were to be appointed, and their appointment was to be solely in the king's hands, and any public expression of opinion on the part of ministers of religion was to be regarded as treasonable. The bulk of the Scottish people endeavored resolutely to thwart this subversion of their Presbyterianism. But in 1618, the General Assembly, and in 1621, in Parliament, a bench of bishops was set up, and the 5 Articles of Perth, embodying James's notion of divine service, were declared to be the law of the Church of Scotland. Kneeling at communion, private baptism, observance of church festivals, and confirmation by the bishops were the novel rites and ceremonies legalized by the Articles. But these laws received scant obedience from the mass of the Scottish people as being repugnant to their deepest religious feelings. The effort to enforce them, from which James never deviated, was a direct incentive to the religious revolt which followed. His church policy was wholly in his own interest, and without regard to the religious feelings of his people, a fact which his subjects fully realized and estimated accordingly. King James delighted to pose as a great peacemaker boasting that the scepter and pen were mightier than the sword. But his well-meant pacific policy was foredoomed to failure. For his neglect of the fleet, sedulously reared by Queen Elizabeth, had reduced that great fighting force to impotence. The Spanish fleet could sail up the Channel, almost unmolested, to pursue Spain's devastating persecutions in the Netherlands. The 30 Years' War had broken out, and the forces of Roman Catholic reaction were marching from victory to victory. Bohemia and the Rhenish Palatinate were overrun, and persecutions by the Habsburg armies in the former and by Spanish forces in the latter were threatening the extinction of Protestantism in lurid orgies. James was too proud, or more correctly, too timid to fight, and allowed his own son-in-law with his queen and their infant children to be disinherited and driven from their kingdom. The great liberator of Europe, Gustavus Adolphus, now appeared on the scene. Among his forces were many of our northern clansmen, but opposed to him were also levies of soldiers of fortune from Scotland. There is indeed a penetrating poignancy in the sad and unintentional reproach of the great general's appeal to the Privy Council of Scotland to prevent Scottish levies being sent to his enemies, as he stood defending, in his own words, quote, the one northern bulwark of the evangelicals, unquote, against the Roman reaction. But the shambling pedant, King James, was never too proud to indulge in crooked diplomacy with Spain. At the very moment of Queen Elizabeth's death, he was entertaining Nicholas Sorza, an envoy from the Archdukes Albert and Isabella, who had been governing the Spanish Netherlands. His wife, Anne of Denmark, recanted her Lutheranism for the Roman faith as a result of Father Abercrombie's secret communings with her. She was assisted secretly, according to Scaramelli, by such hard-headed Scots as James' privy councillors, Sir George Hume and Sir James Elphinstone, and in her maneuverings and Roman Catholic intrigues. And when James had failed with his miserable scheme for a Spanish match for his son, he succeeded with a marriage scheme only 1 degree less fatal, by having his son Charles married to the zealous Romanist Henrietta Maria of France, who became the mother of many troubles to sadly distracted Scotland. 3. Charles I inherited his father's policy of absolute monarchy, but none of his knowledge of Scotland, nor of his caution. The notorious Laud was primate of England. Laud was an Arminian in theology, and he hated Calvinism. There was a phase of Arminianism which emphasized the competence of the state in ecclesiastical as well as civil affairs, as against the Calvinist view of the sovereignty of Christ over both, which admirably suited Laud's autocratic theory. Because he hated Calvinism, he, however, made the fatal mistake of thinking there was no religion in Calvinistic Scotland. Charles made a like mistake in thinking that he could act as absolute monarch in Scotland even in matters of religion. Laud was an Oxford Don, a self-conscious and important high churchman who made the second fatal mistake of imagining that he could prune the prickly branches of Scottish theology and ecclesiasticism as easily as he could trim the wings of soaring university undergraduates. Scotsmen detested English episcopacy, a fact which neither Laud nor Charles dimly realized, just because they saw in it some similarity to Roman Catholicism. And they had the burning conviction that Protestantism could never be safe in Scotland until the latter was wholly stamped out. When Laud therefore induced Charles to impose the liturgy on the Scottish people, a light was applied to the train that had long been laid. According to Rowe, the historian, the detested liturgy was a, quote, Popish, English, Scottish Mass service book, unquote. It was indeed its Roman Catholic features that roused the slumbering nation into active revolt. Episcopacy was abolished in 1638, and Presbyterianism was re-established in its place. The covenant was signed. The nation, in the words of Milton, quote, roused herself like a strong man after sleep and shook her invincible locks, unquote. In the words of the latest disinterested writer of history, G.M. Trevelyan, quote, the covenant with God was renewed in 1638 and embraced all ranks from the highest to the lowest. In every parish men signed it, weeping and lifting their right hands to heaven. When the Scots display emotion, something real is active within them. Indeed, the country had not been so moved since the days of Wallace and Bruce, unquote. But this genuine religious enthusiasm and emotion were not confined to lowland Scotland. On the 25th of April, 1638, there was at Inverness the most unique and imposing assemblage of almost all the northern clansmen which ever met in one place. And the impression created by such massing of the clans in peaceful concord is not exaggerated by the Earl of Rothes when he writes in his Relation, quote, it was professed by all that it was the joyfulest day that ever they saw, or even was seen in the north. And it was marked as a special mark of God's goodness towards these parts that so many different clans and names, among whom was nothing before but hostility and blood, were met together in one place for such a good cause and in so peaceable a manner, as that nothing was to be seen and heard but mutual embracements, with hearty praise to God for so happy a union, unquote. Thus then, both in north and south, Scotland was in revolt against the king. Not, be it noted, because he was a king or a Stuart, for Scotland as a whole was loyal, and at times foolishly loyal, to the Stuart dynasty. But they opposed Charles because he acted on the impious assumption of his father, who infringed the constitution in making it, namely, that his subjects were bound to take their religion from him. 4 years later, the English people in the Long Parliament were also in open revolt against the king. Then followed the First Bishops' War, the temporary triumph of the Covenanters, and the insincere submission of Charles. There followed upon that an alliance of the Scottish and English insurgents under the Solemn League. The ideals of universal Presbyterianism expressed by the League were noble and reflected an intense conviction, but England was too long wedded to episcopacy to accept them now. And the habit of obedience to the crown, inherited from the Tudor age, was too deeply ingrained in their social life to ensure a successful issue to the alliance. Besides, the causes of the Scots and English differed in origin and in their national ends. The ground of the Scottish quarrel was wholly religious, while the English quarrel sprang from questions of polity and constitutional politics. The issue in England was the abolition of monarchy and the establishment of a commonwealth. In Scotland, after merciless and devastating wars, the result was a dislike for the protectorate and a persistent effort to induce the monarch to be a covenanted king. But he refused and met his doom at Whitehall. Then Scotland, still attached to the monarchical idea, turned to his son, Charles II. 4. Charles II insincerely accepted the covenants with all their implications. But an incorrigible voluptuary, who was more interested in his dogs and mistresses than in true religion, soon revealed his intention of making Scotland in religion and politics a mere dependency of England, by annulling by one sweeping stroke all covenanting legislation since 1637, and setting up episcopacy again. The ecclesiastical basis of national life, which was erected in 1638, was thus razed to the ground. But the spirit of the builders, which exercised a profound influence on the national character, was still alive, and what they cherished as their dearest possession for time and eternity, they were not to relinquish readily for a government and polity which outraged their consciences. Charles, with a hatred of the covenant he signed and a dread of an end like his father's, therefore bent all his energies through willing satraps to stamp out the covenants and covenanters in a manner so merciless and revolting as showed him and his menials men devoid of humanity, self-respect, and responsibility, and of any regard for the laws of civilized warfare. Quote, "I will acknowledge," said Lord Shaftesbury, in the House of Lords on the 25th of March, 1679, "I will acknowledge I am not well versed in the particular laws of Scotland, but this I do know, that all the northern countries have by their laws an undoubted and inviolable right to their liberties and properties. Yet Scotland hath outdone all the eastern and southern countries in having their lives, liberties, and estates subjected to the arbitrary will and pleasure of those that govern." Unquote. Charles died receiving what consolation he could from the administration of the rights of Rome and Canterbury over his dying body. Two contemporary witnesses to horrors of his reign can, in their own words, best depict the sufferings for conscience sake that characterized his reign. Coke, an eminent English lawyer and no friend of Covenanters, wrote thus, quote, "And that Lauderdale might not be less active in Scotland than his brother Clifford was in England, and Buckingham and Arlington were in Holland, being armed with these other powers, he made all sorts of people depose upon oath their knowledge of the persons of dissenters, not popish meetings, in the exercise of their worship, upon penalty of fining, imprisonment, banishment, and transportation, and to be sold for slaves, imprisoning all outed ministers who shall preach out of their families till they give security of 5,000 marks Scots, not to do the same again. Every hearer being a tenant to pay 25 pounds Scots, and cotter 12, toties quoties, they shall offend. And that it shall be death for any to preach in fields or houses where any are without doors, and 500 marks reward for any to secure such, dead or alive, and gave order that every man for himself and all under him should give bond, not to go to field meetings, and to inform against, pursue, and deliver up all outed ministers to judgment." Unquote. The other witness is Michael Shields, himself a Covenanter, whose eyes had seen what his pen thus graphically describes of the savage conduct of Charles II. Quote, "His cruelty over the bodies of Christians, and chasing and killing upon the fields many without sentence, and bloody butchering, hanging, heading, mangling, dismembering alive, quartering upon scaffolds, imprisoning, laying in irons, torturing by boots, thumbkins, fire matches, cutting pieces out of the ears of others, banishing and selling as slaves old and young men and women in great numbers, oppressing many others in their estates, forfeiting, robbing, spoiling, pillaging their goods, casting them out of their habitations, interdicting any to reset them under the pain of being treated after the same manner." Unquote. Evangelical Scotland will ever remember with gratitude Holland's hospitality to the many of her pious children who fled to the warm bosom of the Netherland people from such horrors and such acts of tyranny. 5. But the cup of Scotland's woe was not yet full. Charles II was succeeded by James VII, who, as a convinced Roman Catholic, now wished to appear in Scotland as the ally of Louis XIV in exterminating Protestantism in Western Europe. The logical effort of James VII in trying to force Roman Catholicism on Scotland had at least the merit of consistency with the absolutism which he inherited. But logic became a dangerous absurdity which united the separated forces of Protestantism in Scotland, with whom the stronger forces of England made common cause in ridding the country once and for all of a constantly recurring menace to its civil and religious liberties. The Covenanters' part in the long-drawn-out and costly struggle was mainly personal, as of men fighting under the constraints of conscience in view of the judgment seat in eternity. But out of their blood and ashes sprang the tree of civil and religious liberty, under whose branches Scotland has ever since been living in the safety and comfort of freedom. During this period there were, as we noted, two irreconcilable ideals in constant clash. One of these was absolutism, which James VI derived, through d'Aubigny, from the court of France. In the 16th century, the tide of affairs was steadily flowing in the direction of absolutism. And the one man who fundamentally altered the current of events was John Calvin. In the Calvinistic thought, there is a natural law allied to which was the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people. By this law, man has imprescriptible and inalienable rights to justice, liberty, and freedom in religion. When the pact or contract by which their rights are recognized is violated, it releases the other party from obligation to keep it. The application of this law, in which Knox, like Calvin, was a firm believer, found its justification in the tyranny of James VII. Beza, Hotman, and du Plessis-Mornay were the most distinguished of Calvin's followers in Europe. Du Plessis-Mornay's Vindiciae contra tyrannos circulated freely in Scotland during the civil wars and immediately preceding the Revolution. They all believed in this natural law according to which obedience is not due to princes who order, quote, irreligious or iniquitous matters, unquote. Calvin, Hotman, and du Plessis-Mornay were not in favor of tyrannicide, far less regicide. Beza does not approve of those who, without any distribution or exception, condemn all tyrannicide, but all are in agreement on the dethronement of tyranny. Quote, Europe saved by Geneva, unquote, wrote Michelet. Quote, crushed under the weight of a spiritual aristocracy on the one side and ground down by the huge machine of administrative monarchy on the other, unquote, wrote that scholar and discriminating essayist Mark Pattison, quote, the people under the legislation of Calvin began to feel their obligations to substitute free obedience for passive submission. Quote, and, he concludes, Calvinism saved Europe, unquote. So it may as truly be said that Calvinism saved Britain. Moreover, the repeal of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV, James's ally in 1685, with its consequent revolting cruelty to the Huguenots of France, and the constant intriguing of Jesuits at home prepared the mental and emotional elements in British Calvinism for the overthrow of the spiritual absolutism, which James, with a policy of ever-increasing violence and illegality, was endeavoring to force upon an outraged nation. It was indeed a critical time when Protestantism was decadent and Roman Catholicism was in the ascendant in Europe. At home, the nation was bled white with bitter persecution and staggering with constant dread and lack of security of life or property. Its social life was in a state of disorder, and its organized religious life was lacking in intensity and reality. It was at such a time that the Convention of Parliament in Edinburgh, the 11th of May, 1689, deposed James VII and chose William and Mary to occupy the vacant throne on terms and conditions dictated by the Convention. The accession combined the predominant moral and national resources of Holland and Britain, and accordingly proved the stay of European Protestantism and checked the progress of victorious Rome. This epoch-making event has been described as the glorious and happy Revolution. In the main, it was the triumph of the Calvinistic political concept of the sovereignty of the people over kingly absolutism, and of the ecclesiastical polity of Presbyterianism over episcopal polity, much more than the conquest of irreligion by ardent spiritual forces. for it was characterized by none of the spiritual intensity and enthusiasm that marked the beginnings of the Revolution in 1638. On the contrary, perhaps the cream of Scottish piety was still scattered abroad or on the mountains, looking with a fiercely critical antagonism on what was regarded by many as an Erastian settlement and an abrogation of the Covenant ideals. 6. King William III, who ascended the throne, was a sagacious monarch who, unlike his predecessors, sought to govern according to the wish of the governed. He was a clear-sighted diplomat, but an eclectic in ecclesiastical politics and phlegmatic to the extent of ruthlessness in his temperament. Many estimates of his person and character have been given. This new pen portrait of the illustrious Dutchman and his queen at dinner, drawn by a clergyman on the 2nd of February, 1690, from the vantage ground of the gallery of the dining hall at Whitehall, London, and worthy of a smart court reporter of today in its minute and graphic estimate, may not be amiss. Quote, "They were," says the clerical reporter, "served in golden plate and silver dishes. Salt and sugar boxes, knives and forks were gold. They had only 2 services and sweetmeats. The first was of pig, turkey, duck, roast beef, lemon. The second, fricassee, goose, capon, pigeon, tarts, etc. To the ladies, spectators were distributed some of the conserves and sweetmeats after dinner. The napkins of damask were rolled up in the way of a ruff. The king and queen, not near him, sat under a red velvet canopy tissued with black. Where they sat was raised from the floor. The queen ate much better than the king. They drank a small Rhenish 2 glasses, and at last one of sack, all of a large size. King William was apparelled in brown cloth with buttons, and blue waistcoat tissued with strip and lace gold, a black beaver cocked on left side. He is phlegmatic and did spit much at dinner. Queen Mary, fat and of a lively color, clothed in a gown of brown with broad purple and white strips in some places only, one in breast, back, and compassing each arm, her breast embroidered with orange, a stomacher white and blue, a sable about her neck, common gauze white hood with a black end, and a topknot of purple and white flowered and in nothing frolic or vain." Unquote. Whether the distance between the king and queen at dinner was ceremonial etiquette or an illustration of the alleged coolness between them, we need not inquire too closely. But that William was phlegmatic is proved, and with that one cause of his callous indifference to the horrible massacre of Glencoe. The staid composure of both the king and queen is in striking contrast to the flippancy and repulsive vanity and garish show of the Stuart royal court. By the Revolution's settlement, Scotland was freed from the continued attempt of Louis of France to impose Gallican Catholicism, none the less dangerous that it was Gallican, upon a people who hated Catholicism, whether Gallican or papal, root and branch. But more important, it saved Protestantism in Western Europe. For Britain and Holland, jealous rivals in trade and admiralty, under the tutelage of William, then the greatest statesman in Europe and the head of the executive in both countries, gradually contracted habits of close cooperation for purposes of war as absolutely essential for successful warfare against Louis. The successful Battle of La Hogue was the outcome, and from that hour Louis of France was, like Philip of Spain before him, hunted down by a fleet of ships that he never saw, while his threatened hegemony had utterly vanished from being the dread of Protestantism in Europe. It was not, however, without some reason that Covenanters stigmatized William's policy as Erastian, and so justified their refusal to accept the terms of settlement. He hesitated, and indeed seemed to avoid the necessity of a Presbyterian settlement without Erastian control, until the finding of his estates had compelled him to acquiesce in a decision which had not his hearty approval. Dr. David Williamson of St. Cuthbert's, Edinburgh, and certain Scottish noblemen waited on him with the considered judgment of his estates in an address, quote, edged with what a contemporary diarist calls some stingy, keen, and irreverent expressions such as Dutch Erastianism, unquote. For several days he refused to receive this deputation, on the successful issue of whose mission depended the future freedom of Scottish Presbyterianism. Then they craved an audience with him without an address, but this was also refused. Seeing, however, that he had enraged the ministers and a great part of the nobility and gentry of Scotland against him, he deemed it politic to receive the deputation and agree to their proposals for the re-establishment of Presbyterianism free from state control. But in a settlement where the secular spirit prevailed over the spiritual by securing a stable equilibrium between both on a basis of compromises, the king was not slow to remind the assembly of this unpleasant fact. Appointing Lord Carmichael High Commissioner, the king gave instructions to his representative which clearly showed that the assembly still needed assurances that the king would, quote, maintain Presbyterian government, unquote, in the church. But alongside a promise to that effect was a request which showed his toleration for episcopacy, namely, that the commissioner should, quote, induce the assembly to fill the 200 vacant churches in Scotland with good and moderate men, already turned out, who have come to a true sense of their duty, unquote. And if the spirit of the assembly revolted from such a proposal, and the commissioners to the north were still intent on more vacancies, he, quote, should dissolve the assembly, unquote. This shows that the divine right was still casting its shadow across renascent Presbyterianism. The more heroic and sublime spirit of the Covenanters would have taken this proposal less complacently than the Assembly did, and the tragedy of a broken Presbyterianism in Scotland is intimately connected with the extent to which the Assembly yielded to the royal request to admit moderate men into the Church. The compromise between the church and state, the emergence of the moderate men, and the willingness of Presbyterians to settle the establishment of Presbyterianism with a greater regard for considerations of expediency than for supernatural sanctions, show how secular interests predominated over the ecclesiastical, and the wide divergence in thought and conduct between the leaders of Presbyterianism in 1638 and 1690. 7. The revolution, which was practically a bloodless revolution, was, however, regarded as glorious and happy, and was immensely popular. A contemporary Presbyterian historian gives expression to the general feeling in these words of bold assurance, tainted, unfortunately, with some uncharitableness. Quote, "We have therefore," he writes, "one of the best causes to assert, the firmest human laws that can be devised to support it, and our gracious Queen at the head of them, all the Protestant churches in the world on our side, and none but Papists, and some distracted people who call themselves Protestants against it, whose part no Protestant can take but at the expense of his conscience, honor, and interest." Unquote. The claim to world approval and the unchristian effort to discredit and question the sincerity of some distracted people who could not conscientiously accept the terms of settlement are a clear indication of the wave of enthusiasm that spread over all the land. It was an enthusiasm for peace after a long and costly strife which could not understand the feelings and sorrows of those who could not share in the common joy. And then, too, as in the time of every popular religious movement since the days when believers at Antioch were nicknamed Christians, men of conviction were disliked by the crowd in whose enthusiasm they could not share. So was it that the youthful James Renwick, who was ordained at Groningen, a minister of the Universal Church, one of the saintliest and most fragrant flowers of the covenants, was offensively described as a Jesuit. A nickname is the badge which the multitudes in many lands compel sincere minorities against the popular wish to bear. Episcopacy was disestablished and disendowed without serious murmur against the change, for apparently Episcopalians hung loosely to their polity and government. In 1690, according to one of them, the, quote, regular clergy stirred up the people to parley with King James, quote, that no oaths be imposed upon them, and to, quote, moderate the government so that any good minister might safely be of its communion, unquote. If that should happen, quote, it would make 100,000 more friends to King William, and it would soon create a peace and perpetuate it too, unquote. It was a matter of expediency, apparently, rather than of conscience. No wonder, then, though many of the 100,000 found their way into the new establishment, carrying with them an accommodating and moderating spirit which had an effect on the Scottish Church which can be read in the tragic story of the Church in the following century. This audio recording was read by Michael Ives. I hope you found it enlightening and edifying. Visit westportexperiment.com for more audio resources, and where I write about parish missions, the care of souls, and all things Reformed.